Greetings. Welcome to Paris ISD's summer reading program. Today we're going to talk a little bit about how the program works. So by now you should have already received your 10 books, 5 fiction, 5 nonfiction. Plus you also, at the high school level, you probably also received another 5 books that were labeled Literary Element Pack or something like that. Between Mrs. Henry and I, we will be putting out videos for 5 books each. I am doing 3 fiction and 2 nonfiction, and Mrs. Henry is doing 5, and she'll talk about hers, when she makes her videos. So anyway, and one of mine will actually come out of that Literary Elements pack, I believe, but the other ones will come out of that original 10 pack. So I wanted to talk just real briefly about the things that you received in your package. And in your package, you would have received your books, of course, but also a journal that looked like this, and also several activity cards that look like these, yellow and whatnot. For each book, we'll talk about, specifically, what they go over and everything. This one is your reading journal, and here is where you're going to record certain things. On the back here, you have a reading log, and that's where you want to write down all of the books that you read, the 10 books that you read during the program. And here, we have some directions here. And once again, when it comes to the specific books, I'll talk about how to work with this on the specific book. But you have pages that's like this. On the top, they'll say fiction or nonfiction. And this page you can use for any of the 10 books that, regardless of whether they're fiction or nonfiction. On the next page, you have one that said ready, set, text. And that one says fiction. That means that specific activity needs to be done with one of your fiction books. And throughout this whole booklet, there were different activities. And once again, they're labeled for fiction. And then like this page is labeled for nonfiction. And we'll talk about using these for that specific book, through the videos. So I just wanted to give you, just a basic going over of the program. And you want to use this reading journal as well as look at the activities that you have here on this page too as well. So without further ado, let's get back to the book. Hello, everybody. Today's book, or rather this week's book, is called Before Columbus, The Americas Before 1491. It is by Charles C. Mann. And once again, here I am Mrs. McGill. So without further ado, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about our book. The author is Charles C. Mann. He is an American author and journalist. He's a contributing editor for Atlantic Monthly, Science, and Wired, and has written for several other publications such as Smithsonian and Technology Review. He has won several awards. Main one we can talk about, he's a 3-time National Magazine Award finalist and recipient of writing awards from the American Bar Association and the American Institute of Physics, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and the Lannan Foundation. So let's talk a little bit about the book itself. Well, actually, before we get into the book itself, when you look at the foreword by Mr. Mann, he does mention that there are 3 questions, whenever when he was studying history of the Americas, that came to his mind. Those questions were, why did Europeans win against the Native Americans? How the Native Americans never built major had the Native Americans never built major civilizations, and was the New World really an empty landscape? He answers those questions throughout the book. Before we get into that, I do want to take a minute and talk a little bit about Texas. How can we not talk about Texas, and especially our area? Um, Charles C. Mann is going to go over um, so many places throughout North America and South America and Central America as well. I wanted to kind of like zero in on our little spot here with Lamar and Red River counties and give you just a little bit of a brief history, in terms of before we even think about Paris, and whatnot. Um, there was a website called Texas State Historical Association, and they actually had quite a bit of information, specifically about with some articles that came out actually in the Paris News in May of 1921. And I wanted to read you just a couple little snippets from that. Specifically, they were taking information specifically from I assumed it's a book, it didn't really say, called Loose Leaves of Lamar County, that gave some, history of the settling of Lamar and Red River counties. So, I thought that was really interesting. So that's why I kind of, wanted to like throw this out there. On May 12th, 1921, there was one particular article that was published, and it's a couple of highlights that came out of it. And once again, it was from the Loose Leaves of History. And it talked about how in the early 1800s, the United States received what became known as the Indian Territory from the Quapaws. The Caddos made up the majority of the tribes that settled along the Red River on the Texas side, although there were other tribes, like Kickapoo, Coushatta, and Muscogee. The Choctaw, which we know of the most, ended up in Oklahoma, although some settled in Bee Bayou. If you don't know where Bee Bayou is, it is just east of Pattonville. I've seen it. I've been through there. It's not really I wouldn't call it a town. It's kind of like a little community, I guess you could say. So the Choctaw that settled there, they actually helped to keep the peace. So that was like a main takeaway from, that article. And then on May 19th, that sounds like a week later, there was some more information that was published about Lamar County. And this actually kind of dated back a little bit, which actually was interesting to me. So, and I'm going to read this straight from it, just some bits and pieces straight from the article. And they said archaeological evidence indicates that portions of the county lands were occupied by Indians as early as the late Archaic period, around 1500 BC. At the time of first European contact, the area was occupied by the Caddo, an agricultural people with highly developed culture. During the last decade of the 18th century, due to the epidemics that decimated the tribe and problems with the Osages, the Caddos abandoned the village they had occupied for centuries. During the early 1820s, bands of Shawnee, Delaware, and Kickapoo immigrated into what is now Red River County, settling along the banks of the creeks that still bear their names. Although Anglo settlement of the county had already begun, relations between Native Americans and settlers were relatively peaceful. During the mid-1830s, the Native Americans abandoned their settlements. It may be that the first Europeans to enter the county were Frenchmen under the command of Jean-Baptiste Bernard de la Harpe during his expedition of 1718 to 19. Shortly thereafter, the French established Le Poste de Catacoy in the territory of present-day Bowie County. During the decades when small groups of French soldiers, hunters, trappers, and traders occupied the fort, they probably passed through Red River County on numerous occasions. An early account of the area stated that French hunters gave Pecan Point its name. I thought that was kind of interesting just because of the fact that this was, talking about in the 1500s, in through from around 1500 BC, and then, kind of spreading itself out into the 1700s. And, we're talking before we even consider Paris, before we even really consider Texas as Texas, before, you get the idea. And that's why I kind of wanted to share that with you. Just some information of that in that sort. Okay, so back to the book. Part one. So part one, Mann makes this about how old was the New World. He asked that question, and I just wanted to go ahead and get you started with that first page. When Europeans sailed across the Atlantic Ocean in the late 15th century, they found lands that they called a new world. Those lands were the Americas, home to millions of people and some ancient civilizations. One center of civilization arose thousands of years ago in the Andes Mountains of South America. Another took shape far to the north in Mesoamerica, which includes most of Mexico and the lands on its southern border. Forests, swamps, and mountains kept the Andean and Mesoamerican cultures apart, and they were very different from one another. They were also very different from the first societies of Asia, Egypt, and Europe, but they were just about as old. Recent discoveries have shown that civilization in the Americas began earlier than anyone thought. In chapter 1, Mann talks about how he believes that historians got it wrong. They believe that civilization in the Americas began about 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. However, evidence has been found in South America that suggests that it actually goes back as far as 8,000 BC, or that's 10,000 years ago. So much older. In chapter 2, yes, chapter 2, there we go. Chapter 2 talks about, and it's called genetic engineering, talks all about maize, or maize is corn. So it talks all about the development of corn. It also covers how far corn spread around the world. Chapter 3, titled From Olmec to Maya, this chapter examines the Olmec and Maya peoples. And if you notice, where in the main, it does give that little map that's shown right there on your screen, which is really nice because, what he is talking about, I believe, is is where when you're getting into Central America, sometimes, putting that idea of where we're talking about, where these people, actually walked, it's just absolutely, I don't know, fascinating to me. These ancient people were here and they did this and they did that. It's fascinating. But anyway, the Mesoamericans, as these people are known, were very skilled in mathematical knowledge. That was something that's very interesting that has come out in all the studies. And the fourth chapter, which is the final chapter of part 1, is called To the Land of Four Quarters. This chapter covers the history of the Inca. The Inca had many problems with the Spanish. The problems that the Inca had are probably what we remember hearing about the most. And this chapter spreads more light with many details. So part 2, why did Europe succeed? Why did they succeed in, pretty much conquering the Native Americans and taking over the Americas as we know them today? So the same story appears over and over again in history books about the European conquest of the Americas. Time after time, a small group of Europeans defeated a much larger population of Native Americans. Why did the Europeans always win? Indians had no horses, guns, or armor. Indeed, they were often terrified by their first sight of men on horses or exploding cannons. Were those things the key to victory? Or did Europeans succeed in taking over the Americas because of forces outside their control and outside the control of the Native American nations that they conquered? And that's what he attempts to answer in these next 3 chapters. So, chapter 5 is called The Great Meeting. And this chronicles what Mann characterizes as the turning point or the history of the world. In 1519, the Spanish invaded. Give me a minute. I'm going to say this right. Tenochtitlan. Some of these names are hard to pronounce. Tenochtitlan. There we go. Tenochtitlan. So the Spanish invaded Tenochtitlan. And then in chapter 6, entitled Long, Long Ago, who were the Americans? Mann examines the early findings of early archaeological studies in recent times. And he also writes about the Bering Strait and how it is believed that people walked over here using that strip of land, coming over from Asia and Europe and Asia, mainly Asia. Yeah. If you look on a map, the Bering Strait is up there. It's between Siberia, I think it's Siberia, and Alaska. So very interesting. He talks more about that. This chapter somewhat goes backward in that it looks at the very beginnings, because when we're talking about the Bering Strait not being there, we're actually talking like prehistoric times, at the Ice Age area, which kind of leads us to chapter 7, called Extinction. What was life like a long time ago with a whole different type of flora and a whole different type of fauna? So in chapter 7, he travels back in time where the woolly mammoth was king. The Ice Age, in other words. Chapter 8, disease-free paradise. And he asked that question, was this a disease-free paradise, that we've always thought? It's well been known fact that Europeans brought diseases from their homeland, and that these diseases spread to the Native American peoples. He asked the question, well, what happened? And that brings us to part 3. Were the Americas really a wilderness? Living lightly on the land, that's how our school books described Native Americans for many years. Native societies like the Maya and Inca, who built big monuments and practiced large-scale farming, were striking exceptions. Most Indians, we are told, slipped through the forests and plains the same way they slipped through history, barely making a mark. Their impact on the land was so small that when Europeans arrived, they called the land a wilderness. On the contrary, the American landscape before Columbus wasn't like that at all. A growing number of researchers say Native peoples changed their environments or created whole new environments in a number of ways. Their activities shaped the landscape. Their history can still be read in the land if you know how to look. That brings us to chapter 9. I mean, look at this picture. This is the Amazon River and the forest that engulfs the Amazon River. This is what's known as the Amazon rainforest. It is in South America. This forest, and as you can see, the forest follows the Amazon River. And in this chapter, Mann examines who the people and societies that live along the river were. Sorry about that. In chapter 10, Land of Fire, he looks at what role that fire played in the lives of the Native Americans. And then he also starts looking at the mound builders. These are people who built mounds, literally mounds out of dirt, and what were the purpose of these mounds? And that also brings us to the pyramids that are located in South America. Who built them? The Native Americans discovered that changing the landscape could change their lives. chapter 11, that created wilderness. This is the last chapter of the book. Smallpox was examined in chapter 8, and it is revisited in chapter 11. As the disease, it surges again. We also meet the Native Americans meet the settlers, and those are the Pilgrims. And this chapter drives home the idea that the Americas were not a wilderness, as many believe. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about my take on the book. I love history, and especially, the history of the Native Americans, especially from South America, like the Maya, the Inca, the Aztecs. I mean, I'm just absolutely fascinated by those places. Chichen Itza, yeah, I just absolutely, I love learning the history of these people. So a book like this, that really kind of like looks at those things, would be a really good place to start if you're, just starting out learning, that history of those things. That kind of gives me to the idea that, I don't know, to me, it was kind of a downside because these are things like I already knew. But at the same time, if you don't know these things, if you haven't really, gotten into this history, then, it is new information for you. I do strongly suggest that you read it, because the pictures in this book, and there are many pictures, the pictures are beautiful. They are breathtaking. They are magnificent. I mean, yeah, even if you just kind of like thumb through it, just looking at the pictures, do read it though, because I mean, it is, like I said, I find this kind of history fascinating. And this book does provide some interesting insight into well-known historical episodes. So just saying. When you are using your nonfiction, your summer reading journal, make sure that you look at the nonfiction, that you use the nonfiction. This book is nonfiction, so you don't want to choose a fiction work page, because it's going to ask you about characters and stuff. And this is not really that type of book. It's nonfiction. So, I mean, while yes, there are people mentioned and whatnot, it's nonfiction. So remember to use the notification page. Oops, what on earth? I forgot to take that off. So remember, use notification pages. Remember to use the nonfiction pages. There we go. Okay, no, it does say nonfiction. So y'all, yeah, I'm ready to go home. Yeah, remember to use it. Okay, there we go. Those are my references. Those are, the book. I've meant to also include that website. I think that I do have that elsewhere here. You can freeze the video and check that out. So anyway, thanks for stopping in, and y'all have a great day.